I've been asking Ray for probably the better part of 6 or 7 years to speak for us, and with all his credentials, we're very happy that he finally did accept. Ray's an avid student of market psychology and a longtime member of the Market Technicians Association, and the author of an original study of the phenomenon of long bases in stock prices entitled Non-Random Profits. His noteworthy forecasts include the peaking of the tech bubble, last bite, May 2000, the start of the generational secular bear market in equities from the 2000 highs, the year in prospect, January 2001, and the beginning of the secular bull market in resources and gold, the year in prospect, January 2003. Please give a warm welcome to Ray Hansen.
My goodness, I don't recognize the guy that's speaking up here. Thank you very much, Hap, for that very warm and generous introduction. In starting out here today, as Hap says, it's been somewhat of a long journey to get me to this podium, and there's something of a reason for that. Is that I've always felt that there is more to say about what we're doing than simply a new indicator or a new way of putting a series of technical indicators together to yield a market forecast. Certainly that's important, and that occupies the work of so many of us in this room, professionally and for many years. This is the first time that I'm speaking to a public group such as this in many years. And as we start, I would like, going back to the introduction, to pay tribute to or honor the memory of a person whose commitment to technical analysis was very, very significant in the development of the technical community, not only here in Canada, but around the world. And to express a debt of gratitude to this person who actually gave me my first job as a professional market technician. And that person, of course, is Ian S. Notley. Thank you. And when I first met Ian, it was back in 1979, when I was giving a talk in New York on my then recently published study, Non-Random Profits, that was alluded to in the intro. And it's going to show up in here, not in words, but in the phenomenon of bubbles. Okay? That's what this study was about. And I met Ian at that talk and found very early on that what was interesting to me most of Ian and his work was an appreciation of global interactions, not only among stock markets, but interest rates, commodities, currencies, the works. And it's that studying of interrelationships that I think has become increasingly important over time, and certainly has been extremely important in my work and in the recent investigations that I've been conducting now that I'm out of the bank. And I want to try to bring all of that material here together. And as we go into that area, we'll put up the next slide. And the question is, who is it that's standing here before you speaking? You know, I think that the one that most people, I think most everybody in this room is most familiar with is this guy over here, right? And that's the one who has been appearing sometimes as a market technician and having forecasts and interpretations as to what's going on in the world of finance and markets. But preceding that fellow was the one at the top, and that one you may not know, and that's Ray, and is at the point of his graduation from college in 1968. And at that point, I was studying to be a Roman Catholic priest. I currently have no formal religious affiliation, but there was a lot of studying and a lot of investigating going on during those years. And as came out in the introduction, literature and philosophy, and then graduate work in religious studies, theology, and comparative religion. That certainly came to inform, not on an ideological basis, but on a how to ask questions basis, a lot of what's going to follow here today. So yes, I think I think it's established or accepted that there are credentials here as a market technician, but I think there are also credentials that argue that given my lifelong interest in large-scale phenomena shown in non-random profits in the stock market, that there is something to be said about a way of organizing information, and I want to share some of that with you today. And note that the picture at the top, that's on the shores of Narragansett Bay in Warwick, Rhode Island, and that shore is the shoreline of the great estate of Senator Nelson Aldrich. And he's going to appear later in the show. Little did I know. This is many years ago. Now the fellow on the right, that's sort of the artsy Ray, who in his free time, before I had nothing but free time, likes to take pictures. I'm an amateur photographer and also an amateur performer of song, American Songbook, and then some French art songs and German Lieder and all that. And then finally, there's the fellow at the bottom. That looks a little bit more comfortable. And he's the one, now that I'm out of the main line, can kind of sit back and say, hey, what was that all about? And it's that fellow that's going to be doing most of the talking here today. So as we get started, I want to acknowledge the fact that this guy at the bottom has a certain vulnerability about him, because I'm not coming to you the way you're used to seeing me. And what I'm going to be presenting is a different look on things than what maybe you're expecting, probably what you're expecting. But I do hope that there'll be something in here that each one of us can take away. And I'm learning stuff from you all the time in my conversations, and I really appreciate it. That there'll be something in here that can say something to the conduct of our lives, as well as the conduct of our professional work. So we're going to start out with a few home photos. We won't do the whole torture of the home movies. We'll just do a few still shots. And here we are in Times Square, now just a couple of years ago, actually. And what you can see is the whole spectrum, the huge hubbub at the street level, the little lady down there facing the camera with the happy smile on, and people basically disoriented, trying to figure out what the heck's going on. And then as you go higher, things clear up, and in the far distance, you can see the top of the Chrysler Building. And I would represent that this kind of hubbub is certainly what I experienced when I went to New York to begin working with Ian in 1980. And that kind of feeling has stayed with me all along the way, except it's attached itself to different things and different experiences as the amount of information we have to deal with day to day has inexorably grown. So you say, okay, well, maybe I can cope with this by getting a different angle, a different line of sight into what's going on. You try to get an edge, right? That's what we do. And then at the end of the day, though, you say, my God, I still got to figure this out. I have my atlas with the world on my shoulders. Not only is this stuff inherently confusing and self-contradictory, I've got clients that are expecting me to tell them what it means, right? And we're carrying that around with us all the time, right? And all the while this is going on, we're saying, and probably our families are telling us too, hey, why don't you get some work-life balance, right? And we certainly yearn to be able to go lie out there on the sheep meadow in Central Park and read a book. Now, the question is, how do we get to do that, if at all? Hey, well, okay, this is kind of the normal way of looking at things. We've tried different angles and that. Supposing we get a real close-up, right? That's a rose. Not quite sure what it is at first, but there it is, sort of emerging. Or there, another picture of a different rose. Could be a wave crashing on a beach. Could be anything you want to imagine it to, if you look close enough. And then this one, which is a very tiny, about the size of the head of a Ticonderoga pencil eraser, a little shoot coming out of a peace lily. And this particular image means a lot to me because in the iconography of colors and the emotional associations, green is the color of hope, and not surprisingly because it speaks to new life, regeneration. And there it is up close, and if you imagine hard enough, you can see the shape of a heart in there. So where's all this going? Well, we've tried the normal hubbub, trying to sort it all out. Now we kind of looked in close. And then the real issue, and a real bubble that's with us, that we're not terribly conscious of, that we're going to go into in much more detail, is that we're looking at things through particular lenses. And we're not always aware of what lens we're looking through. And as we try to solve the problems of the day, whether it's how to cope with our office issues, or how to cope with the Ukraine and Crimea, or Syria, or Israel, and the Palestinians, all of that, as we try to cope with that, we're always looking through the same lens, and we're going to talk about that lens a lot. What we really need to do is to get an entirely different perspective. How about that one? I didn't take this shot, although I wish I did. The first time these images began coming back was really an earth-changing experience, not only for me personally, but for, untold millions around the world. Because there we are. It's a pretty small place, floating in a huge sea of stars, and it's basically an Earthrise from the moon. In order to make real change, we've got to really try to find a different line of sight into the issues. And one of the great fallacies, I believe, that we operate under, and the great burdens that we have, is that if we keep trying to solve the problem with the same tools we've always had, how are we going to get rid of the problems? These problems are very much programmed into us, and we have to look at a bit at that programming, and that's where this is going, all against the background of the stock market. So, how about this one? This is a selfie taken at the at the entrance to the Havana Aquarium in Cuba back about 3 years ago when I was visiting there. And this clown, very important figure, because that's kind of the way I felt starting to make institutional presentations in New York, circa 1981. The technician was sort of, paid entertainment for far better educated fundamental analysts or PMs, right? That's the way it worked. But there's another point to the clown. This is also, if you want, the court jester, or Polonius in Hamlet. There's a very, very, very rich history of what clowns do. And they have a habit of saying things that no one else will. And they'll say it to people that can do something about it, including getting them shot or whatever. But clowns are very, very rich in significance. And the thing is that as technicians early on, 30 years ago, we were tended to be regarded more as entertainment than providing something of serious value. But I think that all of that has changed, and a lot of that has to do with the work of the CSTA, the MTA, and so on, and how we've come to see the world of the stock market a bit differently. But we want to try now to get from the Earth to the moon and look back again. And here's a cute way of expressing it. I think as technicians, we're naturally drawn to looking at things in a different way, because our job, in many ways, and certainly back then, was to try to get the backstory on what's playing in the news. You got to go look at the charts, you got to study the numbers, say, hey, there's something going on here. What's this? Right? So naturally, we're drawn to think that way, I believe, as technicians, especially those that started out in different areas like Hap or myself, and come into this and say, how do you make sense out of it? All right, so what are we going to do? This is back in 2001. NASDAQ 5000, New Paradigm or Old Mania, published in April of 2000. That's kind of interesting. The peak of the NASDAQ, the peak of the dot-com bubble was in March. And there is April. And then in May, same year, I thought it was a cute title and I rather like it, The Last Bite. This is the real deal here. This is what's important. Not that we made a call, but that phenomenon. Because it exists at various levels. In the stock market, we see bubbles of this sort that we get excited at. They last 2 or 3 years from when they take off to when they peak. And a lot of money is made, a lot of money is lost. But the thing is that there are bubbles, if you will, that happen in our mental space, that happen in the mental space of entire societies and indeed of the whole world. And that's where this talk wants to go, and I hope that you will stay with me and go there. So what about these bubbles? That's what we want to talk about. Well, after you get a big bubble like that, you can get a sideways pattern that lasts for a long time. That bubble peaked in 2000. We just started breaking out a little over a year ago, 13 years later. That's what happened in 1968, the circle on the left, over to the final bear market lows in August of 1982. And what I want to start focusing attention on is the most recent traverse, I guess from that way, from 2000 to where we are today. We know what that looks like on a chart, on the S&P, it's kind of going in a big range until you finally break out at 1,500, 1,650. And we were there for a long time, more than a decade. But what's really interesting is that during that period, something that's never happened on this scale before happened. And that's going to do with corporate profitability. It's been going through the roof. And the amount of wealth and income generated in the United States, we're talking about the United States because I'm, both sides, and I think the United States provides the most crystal clear examples of what we want to talk about. During that period, enormous wealth has been generated, but something in the range, depending on who you want to read, including Piketty, somewhere between 90 and 99% of it went to a very small tranche of people. What about that? That's what we want to investigate, because that phenomenon, I believe, is a telltale sign of something much bigger, and it's a mark of a much bigger bubble, and such a huge one that we're not aware of it. And it's been building now for 300 years. Okay? And we're going to talk about that bubble and what that may mean to the kind of choices that we make as we go through our day-to-day work, home, enjoyment, and so on. Here's what's happened during this traverse. I think this is a fabulous, right? Fabulous, fabulous photo. For those who may not be able to read it in the back, the two buffalo are looking at this guy standing over there in the field, and they're saying, they once inhabited a vast swath of North America, but their numbers have been greatly reduced. And the fellow standing over there has a T-shirt that says middle class on it. What about that? What about that? Well, what about this? Jimmy Goldsmith. Some of you with a long history may remember him. He was one of the early so-called robber barons and restructurers operating out of Paris and London during the 70s and 80s. He retired from formal business in 1990 and came out of retirement in 1994 to start a minority party in France and to write this book and come to the United States and appear on talk shows and talk about it. He was introduced by Charlie Rose. He gave testimony before the US Congress on what he called the trap. I'm going to leave this picture up here for a while I go on. What does it say at the bottom? Rising long-term unemployment, increasing violence, growing poverty in urban slums, environmental deterioration, and a general realization that something fundamental has gone wrong. That's what's on the cover of this in 1994. So, what did James Goldsmith have to say? I'm going to read some stuff here. One of the great defects of modern culture is that we are taught to believe that every problem can be measured in economic terms. But when society's principal tool is measurement rather than understanding, great mistakes follow. Gross national product is the official index used to assess prosperity, but GNP measures only activity. It measures neither prosperity nor well-being. For example, the cost of cancer in America is estimated at $110 billion per annum. This is 1994, equal to 1.7% of GNP. The cost of drug use, $200 billion, or 3.1%. The cost of crime, $163 billion, or 2.6% of GNP. And these three areas alone contribute $473 billion, or 7.4% to the nation's GNP, and they are all growing. I'll bet some of them still are. These three areas alone, right, they happen to be extreme examples, certainly, but they demonstrate that the GNP is not a qualitative measurement, but only a measure of activity, both good and bad. Nevertheless, all our official statistics are based on the one objective: growth in GNP. And our plans for social development are subservient to it. That's how we can get a defense budget, 57% of discretionary spending in education at 6%, for example. So he goes on, we have taken tools of social organization and made them our master. You cannot enrich a country by impoverishing its people. I do not believe at bottom that the health of an economy is measured by the profitability of its corporations at all. I do believe that profits are important, but even more important is the health of the population in terms of its participation. And that's what's gone incredibly awry over the last decade plus. The question is, how is that happening? It seems almost obvious when you hear it. He saw it in 1994. Here we are 20 years later, and saying, what the hell happened? He put his finger on it at the outset, or before it happened, and he came over and railed against the approval of the GATT treaty, because what he foresaw from that is the following consequence. Very lapidary statement, and it's one to think about and never lose sight of. He said, what these treaties, he was referring now to NAFTA before it, then GATT, which was then coming in, and he started a party to make people aware what they were buying into. Right? He said, if we do this, the inevitable consequence will be, over time, you will find that the poor people of rich countries, i.e. our dwindling middle class, right, that the now poor people of rich countries will be subsidizing the rich people of poor countries. How does that sound? That's what this guy said. Not bad as forecasting goes, as I see it. So, now, say, how do we try to make sense out of this? Now we're going to go philosophical. Please, if you must fall asleep, don't snore. But this is really, really important, because this is what ties it together. Because this is where the shape of the 300-year bubble begins to surface. How in the heck did that happen? Well, let's look inside, because it's the way people behave that create the institutions, and it's the institutions that create the laws, distribute the wealth, and on and on and on, that give us the maldistribution we currently witness. So what was I saying back here? This is the last, I believe this is the best piece of research that I ever did. Not because it's so well written or anything else like that, but because I believe it's so important. And the important part is down here. Moving the goalposts. That's the theme of the talk. Moving the goalposts. We've got to see things in a different way. And here I was talking, because it's January 2012, saying, you know, the Mayan calendar in really big cycles. I did that almost tongue-in-cheek. We all know the world didn't end on December 21st, 2012. But the point was to focus on large cycles. That's a real big one, a 26,000-year cycle of the Earth's orbit in the way it goes through the galactic plane. But what is worth, that's a little bit too big for most individuals. Maybe corporations, but not individuals. All right, so what are we going to look at here? Two ways of looking at the world. The bubble that's been getting blown for 300 years that I believe is ultimately responsible for the shape of the world as we see it. And that one is the world as we've known it, and I call that the scarcity model. And then the other one, which I believe is in the process of emerging, and we are beginning to recognize more and more day by day, is an abundance model. It's almost difficult to think about abundance in a world where we're advertising the things that we're advertising by way of events. So I'm going to put up a chart here. Don't even try to focus on it, okay? There's too much here. There's too much here. But this is the scarcity model. And what drives it, just listen to what I'm saying, what drives it is at the top of the pyramid. And it's a way of looking at the world defined by prevailing science. And the science that's defined the shape of our world, I believe, helps create what has come to be seen as a scarcity model. And the physics that allow this to happen is Isaac Newton, back in the late 1600s when he wrote about gravity and a lot of other things that we learned back in late grammar school now and in high school about billiard balls on a table. You've got a closed energy system. You whack one, it bounces around other balls, the energy transfers, you lose stuffed entropy, and eventually everything stops. Closed energy system. Very powerful image, very powerful image. That was reinforced about 100 years later, 1798, by Thomas Malthus, who told us, hey, there's not enough food to go around. You know, this whole setup isn't going to work. We're all going to be dead pretty soon. 1798, not enough to go around. Then about 50 years after him, we get Charles Darwin telling us about evolution and the survival of the species. Well, you put that stuff together and you've got a hugely powerful cocktail that tells us that there's only a pie that's so big, the pie isn't going to grow, And all it does is get smaller and eaten up over time. And it's a question of making sure you get to your piece before somebody else. That's the bedrock. And that set of notions justifies what as an economic structure? It sounds like a scientific explanation of free market capitalism, or better still, unfettered capitalism. Isn't that it? That's what naturally proceeds from this. That's what flows down the sides of that pyramid to the left into society and politics, where the great virtues are, gaming the system. And how much of our analysis is devoted to figuring out which company is going to get the better game going against not only its competitors, but what state to locate the bloody plant in, or what country, and how you're going to get who to do what, et cetera, all to save a certain amount of money, and a lot of that comes through labor costs, right? But there you go. Then on the right-hand side, in business, taking share, efficiency and consolidation, knowledge silos. What comes out of this, and this is the summary, what comes out of this picture is you got three virtues, if you want, coming out of it. One, you've got scarcity operating. What does that breed? The need for security. Because if I don't have security, somebody's going to take mine. Right? That happens not only at the individual level, it happens at the town, the city, the state, the country, the world, all the way out. And that's what it's about, a zero-sum game. So what's the alternative to that? What I described here, and again, don't try to read all the fine print, the emerging paradigm has to do with abundance. And that's based on a new physics that started coming out in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. It takes a long time for this stuff to start coming through, and it is now. Quantum physics. What do you got there? Well, some weird stuff is happening when you get down to really tiny dimensions. And what we know, and it's been proved scientifically, that everything, literally everything is interconnected. And if I do this, it has an effect somehow on the other side of the room. More specifically, if you take a couple of associated particles and you take them apart, you put one at that end of the table, one over at this end of the table, and you tweak one of them, change its spin. That one over there knows that something happened, and it adjusts before light can get from here to there. What's that about? Well, Einstein called it spooky action at a distance. Spooky. Well, yeah. If you say we're all connected, that changes your worldview right away, doesn't it? We're not used to operating that way. We're all used to, I'm going to get mine, and if it's at the expense of someone else, well, that's just the way the laws of the universe work. Right? Science told me. Right? I know that from Newton. I know that from Darwin. And by the way things are set up, how could all these social institutions be wrong? I was born into them. This is the way it is. Right? That's why this is so tough. You got to go to the moon and look back, basically. So, what are the societal symptoms of this stuff happening? Well, we have a physical correlate to this new science because it's actually expressing in physical terms what this implies: connectivity. That's what we have so much about now, don't we? With the advent of the internet, first and foremost, then iPhones, cameras, social media. Forget about the spying aspect for the moment. Just look at what it's doing. It makes it a tangible, visible, so that even we can see that it's there. Connection, instantaneously, pretty much to everything. That's a big deal. And what that has is an inherent challenge to that first triangle. Because this says, or allow people to experiment with and find out, hey, well, supposing if I put up something out there, enough people know about it, I can get something going, and something can work. That wasn't there before. It basically costs nothing, and some people are happy or they're involved. Okay? That's what's really, really interesting. That's what's new, and that's a challenge to the old order. How does that express itself, politically? Well, what about the Arab Spring? What about Occupy Wall Street? And by the way, whatever the heck happened to that? We'll get there. Economics and business. We're now talking about behavioral finance, right? And the power of liking or not liking something. The example that I had 2.5 years ago was just before this was published. You had that big fluff with the Bank of America wanted to charge people $5 a month to use their debit cards, and a whole bunch of craziness broke out on the internet, and they rescinded the thing. So now what do we have in terms of doing deals? Well, we have crowdfunding. That wasn't possible. The question going forward is, are we going to be able to keep it and develop institutions that reflect an underlying science and reality of connectivity instead of scarcity, security, and what goes along with security? Secrecy. We're talking now about shared knowledge, shared experience. Take a very simple example, Tesla just now, the way they're going to deal with patents in the future. You're seeing these little cracks beginning to appear where we're going to be attempting to form new institutions based on the implicit assumptions and the reality, as we see it now, of the way things actually are, a better way of seeing them. So here's what I contrast these two ways, triangle one, triangle two. I call it the old muddle, business muddle, play on words, and the new model. And you look at it and you say, well, what we're used to is the one on the left, right? Isolation, rugged individualism, compartmentalization, supply chains taking share, gaming the system, and what does all that result in? Fear. You're never secure. You're never going to have enough. Somebody's going to take it away from you. What about my kids? Do I want them to go through this? Very real stuff. You go to the other model, which is emerging, I believe, and what are the realities, or the networking, connectivity, thinking in terms of organisms rather than discrete parts, ecosystems, and the values that go with that, honesty and trust, because without that, nothing happens. You've got to be willing to share. So here's a great, I think, a wonderful story that helps fix the contrast between these two approaches in the mind. And this was found out, or so the tale goes anyway, by an anthropologist over in Africa. And he's going to do an experiment. He's going to teach the kids something. So he's got a bunch of tribe kids there. He goes over, now at the other end of the room, puts a basket of fruits under a tree, comes over, he says, okay, I'm going to teach you a game. What you're going to do is you're going to all line up, and I'm going to say, ready, set, go, and then you're going to run for the basket of fruits, and whoever gets there first gets the whole basket of fruits. Oh. All right, so he goes, ready, set, go, and then what do? They all look at each other, start laughing, hold hands, they run over there together, make a circle, and they all consume the fruits. How about that one as an example, and doesn't that capture something? So that philosophy, that's a way of looking at the world. It's called Ubuntu, U-B-U-N-T-U. And the basic underlying notion there is based on connectivity, because the implication is, and what the kids replied, well, how can one of us be happy if all the rest of us wouldn't be happy? Right? There's, I think, a wonderful, wonderful representation. So now, take a breather. Here we are, going to go to a free spot and calm down. Because what we're going to do now is go into the second part of this thing, and this gets a little more. It's not philosophically exciting, but I think it may get some juices flowing. And we're going to look at some of the things that I found in my reading over the last few months. And as we start, just a quick show of hands. I'm going to talk about the Federal Reserve. And I'm going to make a statement, true or false. The Fed is a part of a department or agency of the U.S. government, kind of like the U.S. Treasury or the Department of Defense or the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. How many people, show of hands, feel that's a reasonably true statement? Nobody? Does anybody violently disagree? Need to see those hands. Aha, there are a couple in the back. And then you tell me afterwards, a few of them. Okay. The Federal Reserve is a privately held corporation. It is a corporation. And its shares are held by the banks that comprise the different districts. We're going to come back to this because underneath this, there's some reading and some splaining to do. And I'm not about here to explain it all today, because I can't. Certainly not in the time allotted, but I can point you to some things, and the references are in here. One is by this fellow, G. Edward Griffin, It's called The Creature from Jekyll Island. It's now in its 5th edition, 22, 23 printings. I don't know who's buying this stuff, because they're certainly not talking about it on CNBC or in any of the great economic talks that I've had to suffer through, okay? Here's where the laundry comes out. In giving my talks over the years, when you got a panel of 3 people and spewing out all kinds of stuff that, okay, yes, and do they really have any idea what's going on? No, not a clue, and they'll tell you that in their private moments, some of them even in public, right? Somebody's buying this stuff, but you don't hear about it in the normal speeches. So I'm going to read a little bit, again, of stuff. And we're going to talk about not the Fed as we know it today, but we're going to go back to just before what is now known as the Federal Reserve Act was enacted in December of 1913. We're going to go back to the fall of 1910, and that's where a very important meeting happened on Jekyll Island off of Georgia. And who was at that meeting? Well, what turned into the Federal Reserve Act was essentially drafted over the period of 9 or 10 days by 6 people sequestered in private at J.P. Morgan's fabulous hunting lodge that he built with himself and a few friends in order to hash out what would become that legislation. 6 principal people, 6. There were 5 bankers and 1 politician. The bankers were Frank Vanderlip, president of the Citibank of New York, which is a Rockefeller bank. Henry P. Davidson, senior partner at J.P. Morgan and widely recognized as his emissary. Charles D. Norton, president of the First National Bank of New York, which is also a J.P. Morgan-controlled bank. Benjamin Strong, J.P. Morgan's personal lieutenant. And Paul Warburg, who is ultimately the most interesting one of these because he was an immigrant from Germany, came over in 1902 to become a partner at Kuhn Loeb, and he's the scion of a very big banking family in Germany, the Warburg family, with banking interests, another operation in Amsterdam at that time, and on and on and on. And he was the central banking expert. And he's the one who's acknowledged to have drafted the vast bulk and making the points as to what gets included and what does not in this legislation. So what about this thing? Well, none other than Bertie Charles Forbes, who founded Forbes magazine, wrote 6 years later, 1916, quote, "This strangest, most secret expedition in the history of American finance. I'm not romancing. I'm giving the world for the first time the real story of how the famous Aldrich Currency Report," I forgot to tell you the 6th guy, the politician, Senator Nelson W. Aldrich of the state of Rhode Island, who was the Senate Majority Leader and was going to be responsible for getting this thing passed. Okay? So, I'm giving the world for the first time the real story of how the famous Aldrich Currency Report, the foundation of our new currency system, was written. The utmost secrecy was enjoined upon all. The public must not gain a hint of what was to be done. Well, that sounds pretty almost conspiratorial, doesn't it? Well, I haven't swallowed conspiracy theory hook, line, and sinker. Oh, I'm nibbling, all right? But I want you to hear this, because this debate about secrecy at the Federal Reserve, what it might be doing, let's look at where it came from, and let's look at prior history of the United States and some former presidents, going back to a framer of the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson, and see what a number of people had to say about a bank of issue, which is the central bank that creates the currency on behalf of the country. Thomas Jefferson, this is around 1806 or so. "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than our standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, then first by inflation of that currency and then by deflation, the banks and the corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers founded. The issuing power of currency should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. What he was talking about then was the first Bank of the United States, run by the first Treasurer of the United States, Alexander Hamilton. That was a private corporation, a lot of which was foreign owned. The bank had a charter of 20 years, from 1791 to 1811. The charter was not renewed after great fuss. People fussed about this stuff back then. Then you get to Andrew Jackson, 1834. He writes, "If the people only understood, because now we've got the second Bank of the United States going, brought to you by a similar cast of characters." And they had a charter that was going to run out in 1836. He got elected on a Stop the Bank charter in 1834. "If the people only understood the rank injustice of our money and banking system, there would be a revolution by morning." And elsewhere he says, "The bold efforts of the present central bank, the bold efforts it has made to control the government, are but premonitions of the fate that await the American people should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution." How's that sound? Well, that charter was not renewed in 1836. But we reconvened 75 years later on Jekyll Island. And Paul Warburg, the chief architect, not only of this system, but of the actual writing, was interviewed by Clarence Barron. Remember Barron's magazine? In 1915, 2 years after this thing was passed. Asked by Clarence Barron whether he approved of the bill as finally passed, he remarked, "Well, it hasn't got quite everything we want, but the lack can be adjusted later by administrative process." End quote. So whatever did they get? Leave that to everybody's imagination. But the man who signed the bill, President Wilson, who was famous for many things, including the League of Nations and being very philosophically idealistic, he signed on to this. And then in 1919, 6 years after the passing, he wrote, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." What was he looking at? And then, by no less a revolutionary than Henry Ford, we hear the following in 1922, echoing Andrew Jackson. "It's well enough that the people of our nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, because if they did, there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." Henry Ford. So, go forward another few years. Dwight D. Eisenhower, his farewell address to the nation in January 1961. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. So, how are we doing on all this? What I want to show now is something really, really interesting, because it's the first real study of interconnectivity and control of ownership done on a global scale. And this was was published in October of 2011 by a group of 3 advanced systems scientists in Switzerland. It's in Zurich. It's the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. That's generally recognized as being perhaps, if not just about the finest school, like the MIT, if you want, of Europe. And what did they find? Well, they found a network of global corporate control. That's the title of their paper. And what they found by studying ownership and actual trade figures and so on of 43,000 transnational corporations. This is based on data as of 2007. So part of that world has changed. But at the center of these 43,000 TNCs, there's a highly connected core of 1,300 companies. And within that core of 1,300, 146 top players control 40% of all the TNC's value by market cap and 60% of all profitability. Pretty fascinating. Here's what it looks like. So what we got is a network or systems diagram. And what you got are nodes, those are entities, and the green lines connecting them. The red ones are more powerfully connected than the little yellow ones. And at the end of the day, 75% of the core of that 146 are financial institutions. So if you want to know what the military-industrial complex looks like, abstracted out from all the corporate records and where the ownership really lies, what the board crossovers really mean, you've got these three advanced systems guys looking at the organization of the corporate world for the first time through the eyes of complex systems. And that's what they found. The guys that did this study said, you know, this whole structure exhibits what they call properties of emergence. So one of the three writers, his name is J.B. Glatfelder, and there's a 14-minute YouTube, and I urge you to listen to this, just as I urge you to listen to the Charlie Rose interview with James Goldsmith back in 1994. The YouTube link is in the bibliography too. Very powerful. But what this guy said, and this is on the issue of conspiracy, he said, you know, we could go about reproducing the TNC network with some rules, some rules of interaction. But he said, from what we can see so far, what we've got means that the structure of this thing is quite probably the result of self-organization. It's an emergent property which depends on the rules of interaction within the system. So it's probably not the result of a top-down approach like a conspiracy. Okay, but what you got ultimately is 143 corporations, and you remember all the other stuff that I was reading from the different presidents, ultimately sitting astride this whole thing, right? So do corporations have personalities in the abstract, or do they acquire the functional coloration of the people who control them? They're not asking about that. So what do we do with, where are we going to go with this? Now that we've got a picture of this global control, we're going to go back and look at a couple of other characteristics. We started out with scarcity and security and secrecy. Scarcity, I think, is taken care of in the banking issue, right? Scarcity, how do we denominate what's scarce and what isn't? By money. That's how we keep score. That's essential to the whole process. But then what about safety? At a large scale, we got this, right? The world spent, whatever, $1,700 billion on war in 2012. Who knows what the real number is? And it would take approximately $135 billion to totally eradicate poverty. Well, that bottom number is flaky. The top number is pretty well determinable. It's also determinable or known that at that time, you know, the US spent just shy of $600 billion in that year, which is equivalent to the next 15 people in the world combined. The US did 43% of the global defense budget in that year, 7% to China, 4% each to England and France. So go figure. How safe do we need to be, and how safe do we feel for all that? So here's Eisenhower again, right? For every gun that's made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed, paraphrasing scripture. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, and the hopes of its children. Now, another take on this comes from Gore Vidal. So what happened with, just a moment, on Eisenhower's comments here? He's focusing on the poor and the hungry, the mal-educated. What did we do? Well, we started, obviously, a war on poverty. Right? We went on to start a war, later on drugs, a war on crime. How are we doing on those? We we've managed now to get the biggest prison population in the world of a developed country down there in the United States, a lot of which is becoming privatized. It's a big business. Interesting. That goes to, that adds up into the GNP. Remember, that's very productive. We've got that going on. So it is mind-boggling, and that's what I've experienced as I've had time just to let this kind of wash around. And the more you look, the more intriguing it becomes. So with the war on poverty, the war on drugs, the war on crime, what about the most recent? Right there at the peak in 2000, right? That started that whole thing we talked about. 2001, 9/11, and the war on terror, which is still with us in never-ending prospect. So Gore Vidal, who passed away a couple of years ago, said in his own inimitable way, "You can't have a war on terrorism because it's not an actual enemy. It's an abstract. It's like having a war on dandruff." That war, here's the point, that war will be eternal and pointless. That's not a war, it's a slogan. It is a lie. It's advertising, which is the only art form we ever invented in America. And we use it to sell soap, wars, and presidential candidates in the same fashion. So what I would represent is that we've got here is a war on consciousness. And that's played out in a lot of places. And this is where it gets down to some more current events, and we're almost to the end. How about this? Our great information media. We're told 24/7 about how dangerous the world is, how intractable the problems are. That's all we get, unless you do some off-mainstream looking around for news, and I suspect that everybody in this room does, to some degree. What do? Turn the bloody thing off. And here we are. I love this one. What about all the gobbledygook we hear from the four talking heads in the separate squares on a CNN interview or CNBC interview? Doesn't make any difference. You hear equally strenuous views from the ridiculous side to something that sounds like it makes sense, but nobody is going to moderate that, or call BS on something. It's all thrown up there, and it's up to us to sort it out, to the point where the war on consciousness, you get to believe it's impossible to sort any of it out, and it's not worth trying, because all these experts can't figure it out, so why the hell should I? That's where we are, or an awful lot of it is. And there is an alternative, and that's to think about it differently, and that's what we're trying to do here in my farewell address, if you want, or hello again address. Why don't we hear about this? Iceland. Remember Iceland? Right? Okay, don't read too much. You might get bad ideas. We heard till we were blue in the face about the bail-in over in Cyprus, and we've heard Christine Lagarde and how much ink and video has been expended on creating an IMF package for the Ukraine. Right? What about these folks that actually did something? Don't hear spit about them. They threw the bankers in jail. They put the president in a court, redid Congress, got a constitutional convention together, rewrote the Constitution, and got rid of it all. Bankers went to jail. Here we are 7 years out from our great experience here in the United States. We're just getting around to levying fines on some of the banks. Interesting. Why is that? Then we got something even more, not more interesting, but whistleblowers. This is the part of the technician, remember the clown that tries to find out what the real story is? Now we got a magistrate saying, hey, do you realize that exposing illegal things that your government's been doing is illegal? That's where we are. Idaho, ag-gag laws. You know the conditions under which a lot of animals that we consume in nice shrink-wrap packages laid out before us at Pusatiris, well, not at Pusatiris, but at Loblaws, unwrapped, but exquisitely displayed in Pusatiris. How these animals are raised, the living conditions that they have. Well, legislation is currently enacted in Idaho that it's a felony for a person to take photographs of what's going on there and to make them public. So we're not worried about the illegality or cruelty of the operation. What we're making illegal is letting anybody know that it's going on. What's that? So here's where we got to take a deep breath and look at this. I'm going to read it to you. We've got to take a deep breath and step out of that system for a moment. Try to earth to the moon. We're going to listen to Buddha now. This just gives a flavor for something else. Buddha was asked, what have you gained from meditation? You know that quiet space? He replied, nothing. However, let me tell you what I have lost. Anger, anxiety, depression, insecurity, fear of old age, and death. So notice the questioner. He's back in triangle 1, the scarcity one, saying, what did you gain from meditation? Buddha's saying, I'm looking at it from a different way. Didn't gain anything. Your problem is about gaining. What I did is I've let all those things go because I see things in a different way. So, is it possible to do things in a different way? Well, here's a simple example. Winco Foods, about 15,000 employees operating in 7 or 8 states, mostly in the south of the United States, says lower prices than Walmart. 15,000 people, in average, $11 an hour. It's owned by the employees. Contrast that to Walmart, that's being excoriated to no great effect, at least so far, for having a situation where something in the range of 40% of the employees are on various forms of government assistance in the United States at a cost of billions of dollars a year. And somebody put out a statistic, I don't know whether it's true or not, I didn't do the math, but that the value of last year's Walmart buybacks would have been enough to give a $5,000 a year raise to all the rank and file employees. You know, what's that all about? Here's something that somebody real has done. I met him a few weeks ago. His name is Michael Tellinger. He's a South African. And he started an Ubuntu political party. They did terribly in the election in May. The point is he's trying to start something and get this philosophy out there. It's the one we talked about the kids around the tree in the basket of candy. He's also done a lot of work on the banking system, and he's also done a lot of original archaeological work on ancient civilizations in South Africa. But he's tried to do something. His wife is brilliant, and she's the spreadsheet artist of the thing. And that's what we're getting to, the secret life of spreadsheets. We can start putting that story together. Because here it is. You know, those two triangles. Another way of looking at it. We got about another 3 or 4 minutes to go here. Those two triangles. Another story. Not the young tribes kids getting the candy, but a different story. You know, this comes. You know, the old. Probably all know it, but it certainly bears hearing in this context. The old Cherokee chieftain. Says to his grandson, you've got 2 wolves inside of you. One of them is bad. And he's full of anger, fear, greed, jealousy. And the other one's good. He's filled with empathy, kindness, love, sharing. course, the little boy says, well, which one's going to win? The answer is, whichever one you feed. And that's the message of the spreadsheet, because if you go back, the one that I want to project, I'm using it as a metaphor, which I'm sure you've caught on to by now, as a metaphor. If you go back to the beginning of the talk and the stuff that James Goldsmith was saying about measuring quality of life or gross national happiness rather than gross national product, and how you cannot enrich a country culturally or in any other way by impoverishing its people, which we've somehow managed to do. Not somehow quite as much anymore, I hope, after listening to all this. But, you know, there are choices to be made as to what goes into the spreadsheet. How about total cost accounting, for example? Where are those columns? Well, you leave the cleanup to our children, grandchildren. You wonder about them? So you get a situation where you look at Duke Power, you know, throwing X billions of tons of coal ash into this little river, and you come after them and say, hey, you know, you got to do something about cleaning it up. They get all their lobbyists into there, and they take $435 million last year in tax credits back out of the government for one thing or another, and they spend $6 million lobbying against solar energy in the systems that in the areas that they service. So which one do you want to feed? That's the issue. So a conclusion that I've come to looking at all the war and everything else, and another way that I would express it is that a definition of counterterrorism, and I would call an act of counterterrorism random and unprovoked acts of kindness. We all can do that. You don't need to give money to a charitable intermediary, although I'm not advocating against that. But it's what we choose to do and consciously do it. So the conclusion, what we've just presented is, I believe, the essence of the secret life of spreadsheets. They can have multiple personalities and serve diametrically opposed masters. They are simply tools. But they can be used either to enslave and destroy large swaths of humankind in the name of profit or efficiency, or they can be used to unlock vaults of secrecy in the name of our common good and help liberate the infinite potential of human consciousness. Spreadsheets are tools. They are lenses, and how we choose to use them, what columns we choose to incorporate or to exclude, which lens we choose to look through to see and to shape our world, or which future self we choose to feed, is up to each and every one of us to decide. Thank you very much.